And welcome back. We are going to take a step back today and take a look at our fun tool, the eraser, because there's just a couple more things I want to give you and also hope address a couple issues that people might occasionally have when they're working with the eraser tool. Now, up to this point, we've worked with the eraser tool in the pencil mode. Now, the thing about this is if I have, for example, this background right here, I'm just going to hide these other layers just for a second. All right. And I wanted to erase this white background. You notice that right now my eraser is set to white. If I click and drag across that background, nothing is happening. All right. And it's because this image right now is set to the same color as the eraser. Now, if I wanted to actually remove that background, there's a couple different things we can do. The very first thing, of course, is to simply just unlock this background layer. You can see this little padlock right down here on the background layer. If I click that, it now changes it to layer 0. I'm just going to go ahead and rename this to house just so I know what that is. And now if I take my eraser tool and I start dragging across it, you can see that it now starts erasing that background layer and replacing it with transparency. Now, I do want to show there is other ways to erase other than simply just in pencil mode. Some of you might have noticed before we have things like the brush mode. Now, brush mode is something to be careful about because when we start doing brush mode, it's not going to behave in the same way as how we have our pencil mode. So in brush mode, if I were to click and drag this across, you can see that that is not exactly set to the same level here. You can see that we have different kind of gradient effects coming through. And to really demonstrate this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click a new layer. And let's go ahead and just fill that with a color here. So let's just do color. And we'll make red. That's okay. And of course, this didn't destroy my house. My house is still here. It's just simply just this layer is completely filled with red. And if I take this eraser tool, which is currently set in brush mode, you can see how it'll do this. Now, one of the cool things about this is if I make a pass over the same area, you can see that it will affect what happens here. And of course, you can see like pieces of our house coming through. However, you will see that we still have, for example, like white areas and stuff like that. And that's because of how the brush mode works. It's not going to exactly paint it in the same way as if we were in pencil mode. If I switch this to pencil mode and do the same thing, you can see it is a hard pressing tool that just goes all the way through. That's because the brush mode relies on more pressure to kind of dictate how much you really want to push through that transparency. And so a lot of times we'll end up with kind of this gradient fade out effect. So just something to keep in mind of if you start seeing something like this when you're erasing, it might be your mode. And that's the first thing to check. Now, of course, one thing I do want to point out before we switch is that you, of course, have different brush properties here. And by default, we have this set to 1 pixel, which is fine for our size. But then you have all these different modes in here. And this is part of how the brush tool operates. So, for example, right now we have a soft round. If I click on soft round, you can see how it behaves. It's very familiar to us. But if I switch this to hard round, make a hard round tool, you will see that it is very similar. However, it has a lot stiffer properties compared to the soft one. Notice how quickly it jumped right to that solid white versus in here, it was still much more pink. There are, of course, other brushes that you, of course, can play around. Pressure size is something that you won't have unless you're operating with something like a drawing tablet where you can actually dictate the pressure that you're doing from your pen. If you're just using a keyboard mouse, you're probably not going to have that as much. And of course, there's a bunch of different other brush effects in here. Now, of course, we also have the hardness right here that we can set in a brush. And so, for example, I'm just going to take the same hard round and I'm just going to make a single pass. And you can see with when I decrease that, you can see we have a lot more of those pinkish tones coming through again. Now, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to pencil just for a moment. And I want to remind you that we can, of course, change the size of our erasers, just like we can change the size of our pencil or brush tool using the brackets. So I'm going to go ahead and if I hit that increasing bracket size, I can click that and very quickly erase whole areas. All right, now let's take these principles that we've just reviewed here and take it back to what we were doing with the house. So I'm just going to go to this layer 1 right here. And I'm just going to click the little trash can icon right here to delete that. Yep, I want to go ahead and delete that because it's just kind of for us to see that. And now I can go ahead and remove some of these layers. So I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag that pencil tool or that pencil mode on the eraser right over that. And you can see how quickly it can move, erasing different zones, even though I have changed the size of it. Now, we do have to be careful as we get larger that we don't accidentally click on one of the pixels we want to keep. Now, if I want to decrease this, of course, I can just hit the left bracket to take that down. Now, I do want to show one other thing here that's not quite the pencil tool, but can give us some options for selecting certain regions. So over here, we of course have things like our marquee tool. So if I were to select this region right here, that's a rectangular key. Because this is a rectangle, I can select that. And then I can press the delete key, not backspace, but delete on my keyboard. And it will delete that selection out of there. And effectively what that does is it acts very similar to our eraser tool in removing sections out of there. Now, of course, that may not be the same as what we might be used to with our eraser tool, because remember, eraser tool has different modes, so we can get a lot more control over how things work. Whereas if I hit the delete key, it is simply removing that selection of pixels completely. Now, a couple other modes, of course, we have things like elliptical that will function the same way, but I also want to point out things such as we have our lasso tool, which allows us to grab a region. So if I were to lasso this over this region here, you can see it will make a selection based upon those pixels. And then with that selection, I can also press the delete key, same as how I did before. Or if I come over here and use things like I have magic wand, which will of course try to grab the same colors. It's not always perfect because you can have different tolerance values that might change how those different values work. Or I could even have things like the quick selection tool, which of course my brush is huge right now. And I can of course try to grab certain colors and zones, but it may not always perform how I want to. One thing I do want to show here with you though, let me just go back to, for example, my lasso tool. And if I were to just click off here for a second so we're not grabbing all that. If I were to grab just a small region here, and I were to go back to my eraser tool, and I'm just going to make this really large just for demonstration purposes. Right now I have this region here inside of the house selected. If I were to paint over with that eraser, you can see it is largely restricting it to the area that I have a selection on, just like how we would do if we were to fill with our brush tools and stuff like that. Now, of course, you can see it's not 100% perfect. We do have a little bit of bleed over here. And now I were to decrease this here for a second. Let's go ahead and just deselect that. And I'm going to go ahead and just use a quick selection tool here. And you can see that it selected all that. But if I go back to that lasso tool, which is very helpful, I can, of course, come in here, select these regions, and it'll grab those zones. And then, of course, I can use my eraser tool to then come through and much easily grab these. Now, if it goes outside those bounds a little bit, again, it's not a big deal because we can, of course, always unselect that. Hit E to make the eraser tool, and then we can come in and just manually paint those over ourselves. Now, one thing I do want to show is if I start opening back up my different layers here, you can see that that white is no longer part of the inside of the house, which of course is okay because maybe we want a different color to this house. Now, I've made these pixels transparent currently, so I'm just going to go ahead and erase these ones inside just to kind of finish the job. And let's go ahead and grab all these here. Just to kind of free up our house. All right, and now we have completely taken care of those issues there. And you will notice, of course, because I'm on this bottom layer, if I click here, you'll see it doesn't do anything, of course, to this layer. Now, one last thing I just want to do is maybe just add color back into this house, which, of course, I can, of course, now use things like our paint bucket tool. And maybe I want to go ahead and let's make this house, how about a nice shade of purple here. Just click that fill, and you can see it fills in. Now we do have, you can see some areas here that might have been missed. And of course, this is where we can come in and use things like our eraser tool to kind of come in and manually grab these areas that we didn't get, or erase even zones that are outside of our house a little bit to kind of fill those areas in so this is much more clean. But that's going to wrap up what we have today with the eraser tool, where we can easily come in and do a lot of really cool things very quickly, very easily, and do a whole bunch of different selections, options, and control over what we want in our final image. And we'll see you next time.